Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Agile TD Mondays. Today with David. Hi, David. Welcome.
Hello, Sabine. How are you?
I'm
Greetings
fine.
from the sunny Cotswolds.
I'm fine, thanks. Before David starts, I would like to encourage you to register for the Agile Testing Days this November. If you register now, you can still save up to 500 euros with our super early bird discount pricing. So please register, go to agiletestingdays.com/register, and I will see you there. So, and now to David.
Okay, thanks very much, Sabina, and thank you for attending. Today, I'm going to give you some tips on how you can turn tests into living documentation. Now, in this context, what I'm talking about are automated acceptance tests and scenarios that would be created in a BDD or specification by example process. And by living documentation, I mean documentation that has the benefit that we can rely on it because we can automatically check its truth against our system under test. Now, when we're doing specification by example or BDD, our goal is to have one artifact serve three roles. So the first and perhaps most important thing to get our heads around is that what we're creating when we're doing this is not just a test. In its first role, it's going to serve as a specification for the feature that we have yet to develop. Okay, so we're ideally creating things collaboratively before we've implemented the feature. Secondly, as soon as we have implemented the feature, it becomes an acceptance test to prove that we did what we intended. And thirdly, after we've marked this story done, we've considered the feature complete, it carries on to serve as documentation about that feature. And giving it this three-role purpose means that what we're creating has much more value. It increases the value because it increases the usable life of what we're creating. And secondly, by widening the role, we encourage collective ownership by the whole team. So if we think that what we're creating are just tests, then chances are it's only testers that are likely to take interest in them. But if we're creating something that's useful to the whole team, then the whole team is going to be motivated to help with their creation and to improve them. So let's look at an example of what we mean. Well, hopefully this shows that it doesn't need to be anything particularly heavyweight or complicated. Here we have an example that's just describing a free delivery feature in the context of an online shopping system. And this has a few features that I would consider to be good characteristics. Firstly, it's got a short, meaningful title. Now, my tip here is that you want your title to read like a phrase that you would type into Google to find out about your feature. The next element is the rules, which can take the form of some short, plain language description of the feature, where any important business rules are clearly stated using the appropriate terminology of the business domain. And the third element is a set of explicit examples that illustrate those rules. Now, this is the important part for the test role, because this is what can be automatically checked, okay? So each example here is a separate testable case or scenario, which has explicit data values for all the relevant items that are relating to the business rule, but no more, okay? So we don't want to include any data values that don't have direct relevance to the tests, to the business rules rather. And it's important to include both examples and contrasting counterexamples. So in this case, the first row in the table is the example because it shows a VIP customer ordering 5 books and therefore getting free delivery. But the next 4 rows are all counterexamples. So they're showing small variations from the first example and all leading to the user not being offered free delivery. Some people might think of these as positive and negative tests or happy path and sad path. I tend to use the phrase examples and counterexamples. And it's the ability to see these contrasting examples and counterexamples as a set together that gives the real explanatory power of this. This is where we can really illustrate the rules. So Think of this as the rule of tree, T-R-E, title, rules, examples. But a final characteristic that's worth noting is that a good specification always describes what to test, but not how to test. So all of the mechanics for how we would check these examples should be handled by the test automation layer and not exposed in the specification. So that was what a good example might look like, but unfortunately, lots of BDD artifacts that I come across tend to look a bit more like this rather ugly example. And it has a number of bad smells associated with it. Firstly, there's no explanatory text or rules at all, just a title that suggests this is something to do with a discount, but it doesn't explain what we mean by a bonus discount or the rules that lead to you getting such a discount. It also has too many user interface details, so things like clicking links, typing into fields, and so on. It also has evidence of what I would call pandering to the test tool. So all these repeated wait for the page to load type statements are evidence that a tester has been fighting with the automation tool, and frankly, it looks like they lost that fight. It's also got this mysterious output, where we see our expected result of a 10% discount as the final then, but we've got no idea what it was about the previous steps that actually led to this. And that's primarily because this is just a single example. There are no counterexamples for us to compare against. In essence, the whole of this page is just a script. It's a sequence of actions describing how a test might work, but it's got no useful information on what we're testing or why we get the discount. And all of this is pretty strong evidence that this was actually written by someone after the feature had already been implemented. So in reality, this isn't behavior-driven development at all. If you were, tasked with creating a scenario like this as part of a collaborative discussion with your team about how the bonus discount story or feature would work, chances are you wouldn't write anything that looked like this. Okay, well, now we're going to take another bad example, but this time we're going to try to deconstruct it. We'll reverse engineer some of the business rules and make some improvements to it so that you get a few tips on ways to improve your own examples. Now, this one has quite a number of problems that we'll address. It does require that we get pretty close to the details, so I hope that you've got your brain fully engaged for the next 10 minutes or so. Now, admittedly, your first reaction may be that this example is so dense and unreadable that it just hurts to your head and you can't really make head nor tail of it. Well, that's okay, and we're going to get through that. But that lack of readability is already a strong sign that this is serving a pretty poor job in its role as living documentation. You'd be unlikely to be proud of seeing this somewhere in your documentation suite. But I'm going to help you get through that so that we can turn that around. Now, the first thing we need to do is to distinguish between the three main areas: the given, the when, and then. So this large green box, this whole top section, is the givens, and that's all involving setup of the test. Now, immediately below that is the when clause. That's where we're executing a statement for a certain player on a certain date. And below that is the then section. Now, this is where we are listing transactions that we would expect to be in the statement that's generated. So in the top section where it says, given the following accounts, all we really need to know is that the first account, as number 1, is then used when we set up a user, M. Smith, who has a user ID of 187. So this is really just saying that there's a user, ID 187, who owns account number 1. But further down in the when clause, we see that we execute a statement for that same user 187, although the problem is down here, they're referred to as a player. So there's already some inconsistent domain terminology. That's one of the things that we'll need to fix. So now if we look at the list of 7 transactions in the middle, we can see that they all have a unique transaction ID, but they're also associated with an account ID. And some of them, like the first one, are associated with account number 1. And therefore, that transaction appears in the player's statement. Now, the same is true of transaction number 4. So that appears. And also transaction number 7. So that's also in the statement. So putting this together, all we've really been able to determine at the moment from this rather dense and complicated example is there's a business rule that might be worded along the lines of transactions from a player's account are included in that player's weekly statement, but transactions from other accounts are not. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a very interesting thing to be illustrating with examples like this, because most people would take that kind of business rule to be rather obvious. But we're at least starting to see our way into some of the important data in this example. But what about all this repeated information in the account section? Why are the values all exactly the same? What do they have to do with a weekly statement, if anything? I think this is evidence of a syndrome known as shaving the yak. Now, I'm sure many of you know what shaving the yak means, but if you don't, well, it's simply where you find yourself doing unrelated things because they are getting in the way of you actually doing the thing that you want to do. And in this case, the thing that we want to do is to create a set of transactions for a mix of different accounts. But therefore, we need to create the accounts. And in this system, it seems, accounts have mandatory fields, i.e. name, type, credit limit, balance, and status. Now, none of those things actually have any bearing on our test. But here they are, because we're probably using some generic function that creates accounts, and we are stuffing these with mandatory fields, using any legal values we can get away with because we don't actually care, we won't be using them. So we're shaving the yak, and that's just yak hair, littering our specification and making it harder to understand by filling it up with irrelevant details. All of those details should be hidden and pushed down to the automation layer. Now, the same goes for some of these extra details on the user. When we create the user, all we really need to do is create the relationship between a user and an account. We don't need other information about the user. And the same could be said of this rather obscure GW value on the transactions. So if we sort of mentally filter that yak hair out, what are the actual business rules that we can deduce from what's left in this example? Well, we've already mentioned the first, which is about only showing transactions from the account that is associated with the user whose statement we're executing. That was the rather obvious one. But secondly, there is some indication that a date range is important, since after all, the name of the feature is weekly statement, and the range of transaction dates on the statement is from the 1st to the 7th. The 7th being the date that we executed the statement. So we could say that the statement includes transactions for the last 7 days up to the statement date, but even that assumption is unreliable because there are no counterexamples. If we look in the list of given transactions, there aren't any that are either earlier than the 1st of January or later than the 7th. This doesn't prove that we actually filter the transaction statements to just that 7-day range, even though we would assume that that is what it should do and is therefore an important thing to test. So it looks like this is a test that doesn't have much to say, but takes an awful long time saying it. And of course, there's so much more that it could be saying, but we've not taken the opportunity. It's sort of missed out on answering a number of other questions. So these are the kind of questions that we might expect an implementation team would be asking of the product owner when discussing this feature at a specification workshop or backlog grooming session. So we would expect not only to be able to get good answers to these questions, but for each one we'd be creating good testable specifications with examples that illustrate each of these points. For now, though, we're going to make some assumptions about the rules that we are pretty sure of, and we'll use those as we imply improvements to this example. So we're going to break this big thing up into sections, and we'll deal with them one at a time. And the first thing to improve is the naming and description at the top. Now, clearly, there's a lot of room for improvement here. There's next to nothing useful being said to introduce this. Well, we can fix this by stating the business rules in plain language. So we explicitly state the relationship between transactions, accounts, and players, rules about dates, and we can also say something about the order that the transaction is displayed, and maybe the fields included for each transaction in the statement. And for the scenario description, we'll summarize the situation that we're illustrating with the example data that's follows. So it gives the reader a better introduction to how to interpret the details that follow. Next, we consider the setup of the accounts and players. Now, in this case, we can improve this by actually having less information and not more, because, as we said, most of this is noise. All we really need to know is that there's a relationship between some players and some accounts. So here in this case, we're opting for easy to remember sequences. So it's easy to remember that the ABC of the names, Anna, Bob, and Charlie, correspond in sequence to the accounts they own, i.e. 1, 2, and 3. Now, once again, the mechanics of creating these accounts and these players should all be delegated to the automation layer. So all we're interested in is the relationship between those, not how we create them. That's handled by the test automation. Now, for the given transaction list, well, there are several improvements we need to make here. We want to hide irrelevant data. We want to avoid repeating things redundantly. We want to remove potential ambiguity or confusion. And most importantly, we want to improve the condition coverage as far as the testing of date ranges is concerned, because the data is insufficient at the moment. So what have we done? Well, we've removed the columns that don't have a direct relevance to the text. So anything that doesn't appear in the statement. Now, the amount and currency arguably are relevant because they do appear in the statement, but if we don't actually need to vary those values, we can just set them once in the introductory statement, and again, that removes some noise from our spec. We've also modified the dates because an American looking at the original list of dates could see them as being the first day of each month, from January 1st to July 1st. There's not just readability for Americans we're concerned about. It is possible that the automation layer could also parse those dates as month, day, year. So it's always better to use date values that eliminate that potential ambiguity from the outset. So we've chosen the 20th to the 28th, just to make that easy. We've therefore also modified the transaction IDs to match those day values. Again, this makes transaction identification easier when we know we have to select on the basis of dates. But the important thing from a testing perspective is that we've added 2 transactions that will be outside the 7-day range of the statement. So here, the first one is on the 20th, and the other is on the 28th. And that's so that we can prove that these are explicitly excluded from the weekly statement. And one little extra tweak we've done here is to space out the account numbers. That just makes it that little bit easier for people to distinguish which transactions belong to which accounts, since that's going to be an important relationship for understanding the expected results. And it's little hacks like this one, where we consciously optimize for human understanding as opposed to machine readability. That's where we really start to move towards living documentation. In the final section, this is the when and then clauses. This is where we're making the logical relationship between the inputs, actions, and outputs. There's not really too much that we need to improve other than to make the data consistent with the date and ID changes that we made earlier, and perhaps to put the columns into the order that they would appear on the statement. So that's what it might look like. And with those issues of consistency covered, we can now take the opportunity to demonstrate other rules or other concepts, such as the ability to request statements for other dates. So we could add another table like this, where we just show different examples of players and statement dates given the same setup data, and then we show what are the transactions that we would expect to be included. So it just gives you a little extra power to make sure that you've got good test coverage there. Now, putting all these pieces back together, we end up with roughly the same amount of content we started with, but I hope you'll agree that the final analysis, it's in a more readable form. So we've got much more introductory text and contextual data, the explanation of the rules, more examples down the bottom of different statement scenarios in our then, but in between we've got a lot less extraneous setup details, so our givens become a lot simpler than they were before. So you made it through the deep dive, congratulations, you can relax. But you may be wondering if going to all that trouble is worth the effort, because you're probably thinking, geez, I've got a lot of automated tests to write. Do I need to be doing this amount of thinking on all of them? Well, I believe it is worth it if, as a team, you value these three things. You value specifications that are clear enough for the developers to implement from directly. If you value automated acceptance tests that are faster to diagnose on failure because they're much easier to understand what's going on. And system documentation that combines the power of descriptive rules and concrete examples that illustrate those rules. And therefore, I think it is worth the effort because you get all these three things. You get the specification, tests, and documentation from the same artifact. And because it becomes something that's now useful to the whole team, you'll find the whole team will take ownership of these artifacts and will care about the quality of what we're creating. So you'll find that you're not, as a tester, creating these things alone. And finally, it's because you're creating valuable living documentation. You're not just creating tests. Well, I hope that has been helpful. My details are there on the screen. If you want to reach out to me, I would love to hear from you. You can download a 2-page before and after summary of that example we just walked through. That's available on the links just below the screen here on YouTube. And you'll also find a direct link to the slides that I used on Prezi. So I guess all that remains to be said is thank you very much for watching, and I hope that's been helpful. And especially thank you, Sabine and Agile Testing Days, for letting me be part of Agile TV Mondays. Thanks.
You're welcome, David, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time with me and the viewers. Next week, Umurden Cengiz is going to start our May Agile TD Mondays videos, and he's going to talk about an alternative method to test documentation. Please remember, we see each other in 2 weeks because in Germany there is a national holiday on Monday next week, and therefore we start on the 8th of May. So again, thank you, David.
Thank you.
I hope to see you in November in Potsdam.
Will do, yes.
So see you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.